I was staring down the twin barrels of my .50 caliber machine guns when I realized that Tokyo was dying beneath me, but not from our bombs. The city was suffocating, actually suffocating, like a living organism whose lungs had been sealed shut by an invisible hand. Through the plexiglass bubble of my tailgunner position, 28,000 feet above the Japanese capital, I watched something that no bombing manual had ever described, something that would haunt me for 60 years until this very moment. The B-29 Superfortress, Hell's Angel, shuddered beneath me as we maintained formation with 300 other bombers in the largest incendiary raid of the Pacific War. But what I was seeing below had nothing to do with fire. The city wasn't burning. It was turning grey, street by street, building by building, as if the color was being drained from the world by some cosmic siphon. People in the streets below had stopped running from our bombs and were instead standing perfectly still, their faces turned upward toward our formation, their mouths open in silent screams that I could somehow hear despite the roar of our four Wright R-3350 engines. The temperature in my gun position had dropped 20 degrees in the past 5 minutes, and my breath was fogging the inside of my oxygen mask even though we were flying over a city that should have been an inferno by now. The static in my intercom carried voices that weren't from our crew, Japanese voices, speaking in rapid, panicked bursts that cut through our radio frequency like knives through silk. But the most disturbing thing was the silence that followed each transmission, a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Mike O'Brien over the intercom from his position in the top turret. "Are you guys seeing this?" I was seeing it, but I couldn't process it. Below us, Tokyo was turning into a photograph of itself, a black and white image of a city where no living thing moved and no light source glowed. The bomb craters we had created were filling with what looked like grey sand, and the fires we had ignited were flickering out one by one, until the entire metropolitan area resembled a vast cemetery viewed from the stratosphere. None of them knew that what we witnessed that night would be classified at levels that didn't officially exist. What they didn't realize was that some weapons don't just destroy, they erase, removing not just buildings and bodies, but the very possibility that life had ever existed in the first place. If you're here to hear the truth, stay with me until the end. Subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Some memories need witnesses. To understand how I ended up in that glass bubble above a dying city, we need to go back to a farm in Iowa where a 17-year-old boy first heard the distant thunder of aircraft engines and felt something stir in his chest that he couldn't name. My name is Thomas Edward Kowalski, and I grew up in the corn country southwest of Cedar Rapids during the years when America was still trying to pretend that the war consuming Europe and Asia had nothing to do with us. The farm belonged to my grandfather, Stefan Kowalski, who had immigrated from Poland in 1898, carrying nothing but a battered suitcase and an unshakable belief that American soil could grow anything if you loved it hard enough. He raised corn and soybeans, and 3 generations of Kowalski men who understood that honest work was the only currency that mattered in a world that seemed determined to destroy itself with increasing regularity. I was 17 when I first saw a B-24 Liberator flying over our property at low altitude, its 4 engines creating a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than the sky. The aircraft was olive-drab and battle-scarred, with nose art that I couldn't quite make out from my position in the cornfield, but there was something about its purposeful movement across the Iowa sky that spoke to a part of me I hadn't known existed. It was July 1943, and America had been at war for over a year, but the conflict still felt distant and abstract to a farm boy whose biggest worry was whether the corn would ripen before the first frost. That night at dinner, I told my grandfather about the bomber, describing how it had appeared suddenly over the eastern horizon like a metallic thundercloud and disappeared just as quickly toward the west. He listened without comment, methodically working his way through a plate of pierogi and kielbasa, while my grandmother, Anna, watched both of us with the keen attention of a woman who had learned to read men's faces like weather patterns. "Warplanes," Stefan said finally, setting down his fork. "Flying to the coasts, to the training bases. Pretty soon they'll be flying over other farms, in other countries, carrying death to people who grow their own corn and raise their own children." He looked at me directly, his pale blue eyes holding depths I had never noticed before. "You're thinking about flying, aren't you, Thomas?" I was, though I hadn't admitted it to myself until he spoke the words aloud. The image of that B-24 crossing our sky had planted something in my mind, a seed that was already beginning to sprout into a vision of myself seated behind the controls of such an aircraft, master of a machine that could carry men and weapons across oceans to places I could barely imagine. It was a romantic notion, I realize now, untainted by any real understanding of what aerial warfare actually entailed. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, I had been 16 years old and more concerned with high school basketball than global politics. But by the summer of 1943, with American forces fighting in North Africa and Italy and the Pacific Theater consuming young men like a hungry god, I understood that my generation would not be allowed to sit out this conflict. The choice was not whether to serve, but how to serve. And the memory of that liberator crossing our farm had already made that decision for me. I enlisted in the Army Air Forces on my 18th birthday, walking the 12 miles to the recruitment office in Cedar Rapids because my grandfather's Ford truck had broken down again, and I was too proud to ask for a ride. The recruiting sergeant, a tired-looking man with ribbons from the Great War on his chest, processed my paperwork with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had seen thousands of young men make the same decision for the same reasons. "You want to fly," he said, looking at my application. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. I want to be a pilot." He studied my test scores and physical examination results for a long moment, then stamped my papers with a seal that would change my life forever. "Aerial Gunnery School, Texas. You've got good eyes and steady hands. We need gunners more than we need pilots right now." The trip from Iowa to gunnery school in Kingman, Arizona, was the first time I had ever been more than 50 miles from home. The train carried me across landscapes that seemed impossibly vast and alien. The rolling plains of Kansas, the stark beauty of the Colorado Rockies, the sun-baked desert of the Southwest, where the sky stretched from horizon to horizon without a single cloud to break its perfect blue dome. Other recruits filled the train cars, young men from farms and cities and small towns across America, all of us bound together by our shared ignorance of what lay ahead, and our mutual determination to prove ourselves worthy of the machines we would soon be asked to operate. Gunnery school was 6 months of concentrated brutality designed to transform farm boys and city kids into human weapons systems, capable of operating under conditions that would have driven our fathers mad. We learned to field strip and reassemble, 50 caliber machine guns blindfolded, to calculate deflection angles for targets moving at 300 miles per hour, to function effectively while wearing oxygen masks and electrically heated flight suits at altitudes where the temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero. The instructors were combat veterans from the early Pacific campaigns, hard men with 1,000-yard stares and ribbons that told stories we weren't experienced enough to understand. They taught us that our job was not glory or heroism, but mathematics, calculating angles and distances and relative velocities with split-second precision, while German fighters or Japanese Zeros attempted to kill us in ways that our peacetime minds couldn't fully comprehend. A tail gunner, Sergeant First Class Morrison told us during one particularly brutal training session, has the loneliest job in the Air Force. You sit in a glass bubble at the arse end of a bomber, watching enemy fighters approach from behind while your pilot flies straight and level through flak that can tear your aircraft apart in seconds. Your survival depends entirely on your ability to kill other human beings before they kill you. Some of you will be good at this, some of you won't. Those who aren't good at it won't be coming home. I discovered that I was very good at it. My scores on the aerial gunnery range consistently ranked in the top 5% of my class, and I developed an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional ballistics that impressed even the most cynical instructors. But more importantly, I learned to function in the cramped, isolated environment of a tail gun position, without succumbing to the claustrophobia and panic that drove some men to nervous breakdowns during training flights. By March 1944, I was a qualified aerial gunner with orders to report to a B-29 Superfortress training unit in Kansas, where I would learn to operate the most advanced bomber in the American arsenal. The B-29 was unlike anything that had ever flown, a pressurized high-altitude weapons platform capable of carrying 10 tons of bombs to targets 1,500 miles away. My position would be in the tailgun turret, equipped with twin 50-caliber machine guns and a computing site that could automatically calculate deflection for targets approaching from any angle. The aircraft itself was both beautiful and terrifying. A silver giant with a wingspan longer than a football field and engines that produced more power than anything I had ever imagined. Standing beneath its wing for the first time, I felt like an ant contemplating a cathedral, overwhelmed by the engineering achievement that would soon carry me across the Pacific to wage war against an enemy I had never seen. My crew assignment came in April. 9 other men who would share the risks and isolation of long-range bombing missions over the Japanese home islands. Our pilot was Captain Robert Dutch Hennessy, a quiet man from Oregon with 500 hours in multi-engine aircraft and a reputation for bringing his crews home alive. The bombardier, Lieutenant James Chen, was a Chinese-American from San Francisco whose family had been fighting the Japanese since the rape of Nanking. Our navigator, Lieutenant William Barnes, could find his way across the Pacific using celestial navigation and dead reckoning, with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. We trained together for 3 months, learning to function as a single organism capable of delivering precise destruction to targets thousands of miles from home. The B-29 systems were incredibly complex. Pressurization controls, remote gun turrets, radar navigation equipment, and bomb release mechanisms that required perfect coordination between crew members who might not see each other during an entire mission. Our first combat assignment came in August 1944, the newly constructed airbase at Saipan, where the 20th Air Force was assembling the largest bomber force in aviation history for the systematic destruction of Japanese industrial capacity. The flight from California to the Marianas took 14 hours over empty ocean, and I spent most of it staring out through the plexiglass of my gun position at water that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single landmark to break its monotonous perfection. Saipan was controlled chaos. Hundreds of B-29s parked on coral runways that had been carved from jungle and reef by combat engineers working under constant threat of Japanese attack. The island still bore the scars of the amphibious assault that had captured it 3 months earlier. Burned-out palm trees, abandoned Japanese bunkers, and improvised cemeteries where American Marines and soldiers lay beneath white crosses that looked like flowers from the air. The heat was unbearable, a suffocating combination of tropical humidity and coral dust that made every breath feel like swallowing wet sand. Our quarters were Quonset huts that offered no relief from either the temperature or the insects that seemed determined to devour anything made of flesh. But the worst part was the waiting. Endless hours between missions, when we had nothing to do but think about the flight ahead and the very real possibility that we might not survive it. Our first mission was a daylight raid against aircraft factories in Nagoya, part of a campaign designed to cripple Japanese fighter production before the planned invasion of the home islands. The briefing took place in a sweltering tent where Major Davidson, our squadron commander, outlined the target, the route, and the expected enemy resistance with the clinical detachment of a man discussing crop rotation rather than organized mass killing. "Expect heavy flak over the target," he said, pointing to aerial photographs that showed the factory complex surrounded by anti-aircraft gun positions. Intelligence estimates 50 to 75 enemy fighters, mostly Zeros and some of the new Kawasaki interceptors. Stay in formation, watch your fuel consumption, and remember that your job is to put bombs on target and get your crew home alive. The photographs showed a sprawling industrial complex beside a river, with smokestacks and assembly buildings that looked almost peaceful from the sterile perspective of reconnaissance aircraft. But I knew that those buildings contained thousands of Japanese workers, men and women, whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of a war they probably didn't understand any better than I did. The takeoff at dawn was a carefully choreographed ballet of 4-engine bombers, leaving the ground at 30-second intervals, climbing slowly toward their assigned altitudes, while the tropical sky turned from black to deep blue to the pale gold of sunrise over the Pacific. From my position in the tail, I watched Saipan fall away beneath us until it became just another speck in an ocean that seemed to swallow everything human beings had ever built. The flight to Japan took 7 hours, most of it over empty water broken only by the occasional island or cloud formation. I spent the time checking and rechecking my guns, testing the turret rotation mechanism, and trying not to think about what would happen when we reached the target area. The intercom carried occasional position reports from the navigator and updates from the pilot, but mostly we flew in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts as we approached the moment when training would give way to reality. IP in 10 minutes, Lieutenant Barnes announced over the intercom, as we approached the initial point where our bombing run would begin. Flak ahead, 12 o'clock level. Through my gun sight, I could see black puffs of smoke blooming like deadly flowers in the sky ahead of our formation. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were already tracking us, calculating our speed and altitude, and adjusting their fire to create a wall of exploding steel that we would have to fly through to reach our target. The flak bursts were still distant, but they were getting closer with each passing second. "Bomb bay doors open," Captain Hennessy announced. "Bombardier, you have the aircraft." The next 15 minutes passed in a nightmare of concentrated violence that no amount of training could have prepared me for. German anti-aircraft fire over Europe was reportedly heavier, but the Japanese gunners at Nagoya were accurate and determined, filling the sky around our formation with explosions that shook the B-29 like a child's toy. Through my gun position, I could see other bombers in our group taking hits, engines smoking, wings punctured by shrapnel, one aircraft falling away from formation with its entire tail section shot away. But the worst part wasn't the flak or the enemy fighters that appeared like angry wasps around our formation. The worst part was what I could see happening on the ground below as our bombs found their targets. The aircraft factory disappeared in a series of explosions that sent columns of smoke thousands of feet into the air, but I could also see residential areas catching fire, civilian buildings collapsing, people running through streets that were becoming rivers of flame. "Bombs away!" Lieutenant Chen reported. "Let's get the hell out of here." Nadrai, the flight back to Saipan, was 8 hours of fuel anxiety and mechanical problems that tested every system on our aircraft. We had taken flak damage to our left wing and lost one engine over the target. But Captain Hennessy managed to nurse the wounded bomber across 1,500 miles of open ocean to a landing that felt like resurrection. When the wheels touched Coral Runway, I realized I had been holding my breath for most of the flight home. That night, lying in my bunk and listening to the sound of other crews preparing for the next day's mission, I understood that I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. I was now a participant in the systematic destruction of an entire civilization, a cog in a machine designed to reduce cities to rubble and populations to statistics. The romantic notions I had carried from Iowa were dead, replaced by the knowledge that my job was killing people I had never met for reasons I was beginning to question. Over the following months, those questions would only multiply. We flew missions against targets throughout Japan, aircraft factories, shipping, oil refineries, and eventually the cities themselves. The incendiary raids that began in March 1945 were unlike anything in the history of warfare, designed not just to destroy military targets, but to break the will of the Japanese people by making their homeland uninhabitable. It was during one of those incendiary missions over Tokyo on a night in May 1945 that I witnessed something that would remain classified for decades and that I have never spoken about until this moment. We were flying at our usual altitude of 28,000 feet, part of a formation of over 300 B-29s carrying enough napalm to burn half of the Japanese capital when the impossible began to happen beneath us. The city wasn't just burning, it was dying in a way that defied every law of physics and biology I thought I understood. As our incendiary bombs found their targets, and the fires began to spread through the wooden buildings of Tokyo's residential districts, something else was spreading too, something that turned the flames grey and cold and silent. From my position in the tail gun turret, I watched entire city blocks simply cease to exist, not destroyed by fire or explosion, but erased as if they had never been built in the first place. The people in the streets below stopped running from the fires and instead stood perfectly still, their faces turned upward toward our formation, their mouths open in screams that I could somehow hear despite the impossible distance and the roar of our engines. The temperature in my gun position dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes, and my breath began fogging the inside of my oxygen mask, even though we were flying over what should have been an inferno. The static in our radio frequency carried voices speaking Japanese, rapid and panicked transmissions that cut through our communications like knives, but each transmission ended in a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. "Mother of God," whispered Sergeant O'Brien from his position in the top turret. "The whole city is turning grey." He was right. Below us, Tokyo was losing its color, street by street and building by building, as if someone was draining the life from the world with an invisible siphon. The fires we had started were flickering out one by one, replaced by an advancing wall of grayness that moved with purpose and intelligence through the metropolitan area like a living thing. Through my gun sight, I could see people in the streets who had stopped fleeing the incendiary bombs and were instead standing motionless, their arms raised toward our formation in gestures that looked like either prayer or surrender. But their faces, I could somehow see their faces despite the altitude and the darkness, were expressing something beyond fear or despair. They looked confused, as if they couldn't understand what was happening to their city and their lives. The bomb craters we had created were filling with what looked like grey sand, and the wooden buildings that should have been burning were instead simply fading away like photographs left too long in sunlight. Within 30 minutes, an area of Tokyo that had housed over 1 million people had become a grey wasteland where nothing moved and no light source glowed. "Navigation, can you get a fix on our position?" Captain Hennessy's voice over the intercom carried a tension I had never heard before. "Negative, sir," Lieutenant Barnes replied. "All my reference points are gone. It's like the city just disappeared. But it hadn't disappeared. Through the plexiglass of my gun turret, I could still see the outline of Tokyo Bay, the shape of the river systems, the basic geography that defined the Japanese capital. What was gone was everything human. Every building, every street, every trace that people had ever lived there. In its place was a perfect grey plain that reflected our aircraft's lights like still water. The most disturbing part was the silence. Our radio frequency, which should have been crackling with communications from other aircraft in our formation, carried only an occasional whisper in Japanese that faded in and out like signals from another dimension. The voices sounded young, frightened, speaking words I couldn't understand, but emotions I recognized as universal, the sound of people calling for help that would never come. "Jesus Christ, Tommy," Mike O'Brien whispered over our crew intercom. "Are you recording this?" I was recording it, but the film in my gun camera would later show nothing but empty sky and clouds. The photographs taken during the mission would reveal normal bomb damage and fires, nothing more. Whatever was happening below us was either beyond the ability of our equipment to detect or was being edited out by forces I couldn't understand. As we turned for home, leaving the grey wasteland that had once been Tokyo, I realized that I had witnessed something that would never appear in any after-action report or historical record. Some weapons, I understood now, don't just destroy, they erase, removing not just buildings and bodies, but the very memory that life had ever existed in a particular place. The flight back to Saipan passed in complete silence. None of us spoke about what we had seen, partly because we didn't have words for it, and partly because we instinctively understood that some experiences are too dangerous to share. When we landed on the Coral runway 8 hours later, the ground crews performed their usual post-mission maintenance, as if nothing unusual had happened. The debriefing was perfunctory. Major Davidson asked about flak concentrations, enemy fighter activity, and bomb damage assessment, but he showed no interest in our observations about the unusual effects of the incendiary attack. When I mentioned the grey areas that had appeared in place of burning buildings, he looked at me with the expression of a man who had heard too many combat stress stories and wasn't interested in hearing another one. "Atmospheric conditions can create optical illusions at altitude, Sergeant," he said, making notes in his logbook. "Smoke, fire, and fatigue can make you see things that aren't there. Get some rest and forget whatever you think you saw." But I couldn't forget, and over the following weeks I began to notice that other crews were returning from missions with similar stories. Whispered conversations in the mess tent spoke of cities that had simply stopped existing, of entire districts that had turned grey and silent, of Japanese radio transmissions that carried voices speaking in languages that didn't sound entirely human. The war ended in August 1945, but the questions that had begun during that mission over Tokyo would haunt me for the rest of my life. What kind of weapons had we been carrying? What had we really done to those cities and their populations, and why were the official records so different from what we had actually witnessed from 28,000 feet above the target? I returned to Iowa in September 1945, but the farm that had once seemed like the entire world now felt like a prison. The corn still grew in perfect rows, the seasons still changed with predictable regularity, and my grandfather still believed that honest work was the only currency that mattered. But I carried with me the knowledge that there were forces in the world that could erase entire cities and populations as if they had never existed. And that knowledge made it impossible to find peace in the simple certainties of agricultural life. I never spoke to my family about what I had seen over Tokyo. How do you explain to people who have never left Iowa that you participated in something that violated the fundamental laws of reality? How do you describe weapons that don't just kill, but erase, removing not just life, but the memory of life from places where millions of people once lived and worked and loved. For 60 years, I have carried this story alone, convinced that no one would believe me, and that the official silence surrounding these events was evidence of forces too powerful to challenge. But I am 85 years old now, and most of the men who flew with me are dead, and I believe that some truths are too important to die with the people who witnessed them. The grey areas that appeared in Tokyo that night were not atmospheric illusions or optical effects caused by smoke and fire. They were proof that some weapons transcend mere destruction and enter the realm of erasure, removing not just buildings and bodies, but the very possibility that human life had ever existed in a particular place. What we carried in the bomb bays of our B-29s was something beyond conventional explosives, something that the official histories will never acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require admitting that we had deployed weapons that challenged the basic assumptions about what it means to be human. Tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe. These memories deserve witnesses. Some skies never forget what they saw.